Up to this point, I was able to discover the first hotness list that Avalon Hill published in 1975, and then we checked in every 5 years, in 1980, 1985, and 1990. And then something a bit strange happened. This is Legendary Tactics.
This video is sponsored by Dark City Games. They're an independent wargame company that focuses on small format simple games for either solitaire or small group play. If you're looking for affordable games, check them out. We'll link to their shop at the top.
I was expecting to do the last hotness list from 1995 and then for 1998, as the Avalon Hill Game Company ended up folding that year. But when I looked through copies of the General from 1995, there was no list. After a bit of digging, I found that the last list was done in Volume 29, Number 2 of the General magazine, which was published in 1994. The reason for the change appears to simply be that the editors changed. Don Greenwood was no longer in charge of the General, and Robert Waters took the helm as managing editor. At that point, the decision must have been made to get rid of it. So, in this final episode chronicling the evolution of the hotness lists of Avalon Hill, we will take a look at the top 10 games at that time, towards the end of the existence of Avalon Hill as we knew it. The categories have not changed since the 1990 list. We have a ranking for components, complexity, completeness, playability, authenticity, game length, as well as the year, the type of game, and the sample base. Each game is ranked according to an overall value. What I have noticed going over these lists is that there seems to be something I call value creep. As the list has gone on through time, the overall values of the top games always seem to go lower, meaning that the scores have always improved. Does that mean the games are constantly getting better? Perhaps, but I think it's also that the people rating the games in order to get their favorite game higher on the list rate it slightly better in comparison to a previous list that they were likely referencing. The other thing that is very noticeable is how small the sample sizes have become, and this may be in part why the long-standing feature was cancelled. Only 5 games on the entire list have over 200 ratings, and 3 games barely made the minimum 50 ratings in order to make the cut. I even wonder if there was an effort internally to find employees who were willing to rate these games so they could make the list, as hitting the exact minimum number of ratings 3 times in one list seems a bit suspicious to me. This may be a reflection of the state of the company and of the hobby at the time, but we will take a look regardless. Starting with number 10 on the list, it is Kremlin, with an overall value of 2.28. Kremlin is the game of political maneuvering in the Politburo, where politicians are accused, purged, and pardoned, battling ill health and the ravages of time and stress to gain ultimate power in the Soviet Union. Lower ratings in terms of authenticity at 5.24 and completeness at 3.33 are offset by a decent rating in components at 2.51 and a great playability rating of 1.81. As I mentioned last time, it's great that a multiplayer game of this nature has a very reasonable play time of around 2 hours. At number 9, we have the Russian Front with an overall value of 2.12. This is one of the many games that recreates the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. It is somewhat unique in that it adds air and sea power into the mix, but otherwise has the usual blitzkrieg attacks, encirclements, and the historical ebb and flow of the campaign. It has a combat system that is referred to as quirky and very colorful components. The game has one of the higher complexity ratings in the top 10 at 5.32, and the rest of the ratings are very good, ranging from the mid to high 2s. Its 6.5 hour playtime may be a deterrent for some though. At number 8 we have Upfront. This is the classic game of small-scale squad warfare in World War II, which utilized only cards and a few counters to tell its story. Because everything was abstracted into a deck of cards, it didn't use a map board, which made it quite innovative, even by today's standards. It has an overall value of 2.11. The game also does well in the components rating of 2.24 and in playability at 2.38. It does lose a bit of ground in authenticity at 3.56, however. Games take a little over an hour and a half. Next we have Turning Point Stalingrad, a game which uses an area impulse system which was quite innovative at the time to put players in the shoes of the commanders at the Battle of Stalingrad. The game is played week by week and yard by yard, where the German player is trying to hit their victory requirements and the Russians are doing their very best to stop that from happening. It just edges out up front with an overall rating of 2.10 and generally enjoys better ratings across the board. The only exception to this is in completeness, where it rates a surprising 3.56. Its rating in components of 2.14 is very strong, and the playtime of exactly 5 hours puts it in and around the average for playtime on this list. At number 6, we have Empires in Arms, the grand strategy game of the Napoleonic era. This is a game of massive scope, where up to 7 players each take a nation and try to guide it through a minefield of diplomacy, conflict, peace treaties and alliances, enemies, and backstabbers. With an overall value of 2.08, it again only marginally outranks Turning Point Stalingrad and Up Front. It is one of the more complex games in the top 10 with a rating of 8.08. Playability, likely as a result of the complexity, sits at a disappointing 3.84. To make up for that, the authenticity rating of 2.11 is excellent. And once again, we have the massive playtime, rated at 26 hours, but where the box itself declares the campaign game to take 100 hours or so. At number 5, we have Flat Top. This game recreates the carrier warfare that took place in the Pacific during World War II, primarily between the United States and the Japanese. It is a comprehensive and incredibly detailed game that includes both air and surface combat, submarines, air bases, and supplies, among other things, and utilizes a pretty large map board. The game's overall rating of an even 2.00 is a good step better than the rating for Empires in Arms. Its ratings, though, are a mixed bag. It has great ratings in components at 2.47 and the best authenticity rating on the entire list at 1.76. However, the ratings for completeness at 3.12 and playability at 3.56 are a bit of a letdown. At number 4, we have Civilization, which is a slight improvement in overall value over Flat Top at 1.97. This is a game which begins in and around the time of the beginning of recorded history. Each player commands a civilization in the neighborhood of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, trading and developing their culture and civilization through the use of a technology tree, which was innovative at the time. The game also has a mix of ratings. On one hand, the playability is very high at 1.72 and completeness at 2.03, as well as components at 2.60 are solid assessments. However, the authenticity does suffer a bit at 4.09. In the number 3 spot, we have 1830 Railways and Robber Barons. It is a classic game of investing and managing the growing railroad industry in the eastern United States in that era. Players loved the stock manipulation aspect of the game, although it is pretty cutthroat, which is likely true in spirit to the railroad industry at that time. The overall rating of 1.85 is excellent. Ratings across the board are solid, with a 2.00 for components and a 2.04 for playability. It has a very average rating of 3.20 for authenticity, however. It is surprising and interesting that only 50 people form the sample base, the bare minimum for getting 1830 on the list. One wonders why the number of ratings is so low and why it is exactly 50, but we won't ever know what really happened here. Number 2 is a bit surprising, as it was expected to be number 1 as it was back in 1990. Advanced Squad Leader is a complex and engrossing game that took the original Squad Leader game system to a new level. Players can recreate squad-level conflict in World War II in tremendous detail that still offers a lot of playability. Its overall value at 1.80 is great, as are its other ratings, especially in components at 1.77. Perhaps due to the high complexity of the game, which is rated at 9.25, playability is decidedly average at 3.44. And finally, we arrive at number 1. Can you guess which title was the highest rated game on the final hotness list that Avalon Hill ever published? I'll give you a few seconds to think about it and to make your guess. That title goes to History of the World, with an overall value of 1.56, a significant improvement over Advanced Squad Leader's rating in that category. This is a game that allows players to expand one of 6 different civilizations over thousands of years, with the assumption that all empires fall into decline and disappear eventually. It is a little bit like a reimagined game of Risk. Combat and area control are the primary concerns. All the ratings here are excellent, and the game certainly benefits from the great rating in playability at 1.43, the best on the entire list. If you add in the quality of the components at 1.60 and completeness at 1.63, it's no wonder that this game sits at number 1. However, a couple of things do seem a bit off here. For example, the 1.75 rating for complexity doesn't seem to reflect later assessments, which would put it a bit higher. Also, for some reason the game length is listed at 25 minutes, where the box says something in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 hours. I'm not sure what is going on here, but because there was no subsequent list to correct typos or the like, we will never know. Once again, we will take one last look at the games at the bottom of the list. Tactics 2 has disappeared, presumably because it was out of print at the time. Instead, we have the old stalwart Luftwaffe, the World War II game which pits the Allied bombers versus the German Luftwaffe at the strategic level. The overall value rating here remains the same as last time at 4.80, with all the ratings that follow in and around 4 except for authenticity at 5.33. At second last, we have Waterloo, the classic game from 1962 that allows players to step into the shoes of either Napoleon or Wellington, and to refight the Battle of Waterloo to see if history would have been any different. It is a classic and seminal hex encounter wargame. Its overall rating of 4.44 is a decent improvement over Luftwaffe, and it actually has a decent rating in playability at 2.21, which is likely due to the lower complexity, which is rated at 2.24. Authenticity takes a beating though at 5.55. And we'll look up the list to the third worst game here, which is an old classic from the original Hotness list from 20 years previous, Richthofen's War. This is the classic game of World War I aerial combat that allows players to go back in time and try out one of 32 different aircraft in various missions, or go head-to-head in a classic dogfight. The ratings overall, which are in the high 3s for the most part, are not that bad. The playability rating at 3.24 is actually pretty decent. The exception is the authenticity rating of 4.87, which speaks to the evolution of game design over time more than anything else. And so we end our coverage of the hotness lists of Avalon Hill with 3 classic games that had been listed in the top 12 games of 1975, but now found themselves at the bottom 20 years later. Remember that these ratings were never an evaluation of the fun that these games provided people over the years, and that continue to provide all these years later. The hot games of today will likely be the ones at the bottom of a list somewhere in the future. But this is something to be anticipated and not dreaded as our hobby heads into the future. This is Legendary Tactics.